At 68 years old, Clara Miller stood on the porch of the farmhouse she had called home since she was a toddler. But what her siblings didn't know, what they were too blinded by the developer's check to even consider, was that the worthless stone barn they left her was the most valuable piece of land in the entire state. This is the story of how a woman, discarded by her own blood, became the guardian of a history that money could never buy. If you've ever felt the sting of family choosing profit over people, if you've been told your life's work was nothing more than a line on a ledger, if you've stood in the wreckage of your own life and found the strength to build something new, this story belongs to you. Subscribe now, because the moment Clara turned that heavy cloverleaf key in the rusted lock, she didn't just open a door, she rewrote the future of the entire valley. Clara was 68 that April, a woman with hands that knew the texture of every acre of the Miller farm. She had spent 30 years being the ghost in the hallways of the main house. She was 20 when her mother's lungs began to fail, and the university acceptance letter was placed in a kitchen drawer. She never took it out again. For 15 years, she moved from the garden to the bedside, changing linens and measuring tinctures while the sun rose and set over the north pasture. When her father's mind began to drift like a boat without an anchor, she spent another decade sleeping on a cot at the foot of his bed, so he wouldn't wake up alone in the dark. She managed the billing for the local feed store and kept the farm's books by candlelight after everyone else was asleep. She never asked for a salary. She never asked for her name to be on the deed. She believed that the land was a promise made in sweat and kept in silence. The morning the lawyers arrived, the air was cold enough to see her breath. Clara sat at the heavy oak table she had polished every Saturday for half a century. Her brother James sat opposite her, his suit jacket tight across his shoulders. Her sister Sarah sat next to him, scrolling through her phone and checking her watch every 3 minutes. They had been in the house for less than an hour before the papers were spread across the wood. James didn't look at Clara. He looked at the map the developer had provided. "We have to be realistic, Clara," James said. He used the soft, measured tone he used when he was about to do something terrible. "At your age, you can't manage 400 acres alone. We're worried about you." Sarah looked up from her phone and nodded once. "It's a clean break. This is what's best for everyone, including you. You'll be so much more comfortable in the city." Clara looked at the map. The north pasture, the apple orchard, and the main house were all shaded in red. That was the developer's portion. There was one small, jagged triangle of land at the very edge of the property line that remained white. On it sat the stone barn. It had been built by their great-great-grandfather, but the roof had started to sag 10 years ago. Now, it was a skeleton of grey rock and rotting timber. "The barn," Clara said. Her voice was steady, though her heart was a hammer against her ribs. "It's yours," James said. He pushed a single sheet of paper toward her, the barn and the acre of scrub around it. "It's a generous settlement, considering we're the ones who found the buyer. You've always said you wanted peace and quiet." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright, with a sudden, sharp greed that she couldn't quite mask. "You should have been more financially responsible, Clara. This is what happens when you live your whole life without thinking ahead." Clara looked at her sister. She thought about the 20 years of nursing she had provided for free. She thought about the money Sarah had borrowed for her second wedding and never repaid. Sarah went back to her phone. James stood up and began packing his briefcase. He left a small, heavy object on the table. It was the cast-iron key with the cloverleaf head. Their father had given it to Clara on his last conscious night. He had told her that as long as she held the key, she would never be truly homeless. "The developer starts clearing the north pasture on Monday," James said. "The house needs to be empty by Sunday night. We've already moved Mum and Dad's good furniture into storage for the auction." Clara looked around the room. The walls were already bare. The photographs of her parents were gone. The silver tea service her grandmother had brought from the old country was missing from the sideboard. She reached out and closed her hand around the cloverleaf key. The iron was cold, but the edges were familiar. It was the only thing in the room that still felt like it belonged to her. "I'll be out by Sunday," Clara said. "Good girl," James said. He patted her shoulder as if she were a child. "You'll see, this is a fresh start." He didn't notice that Clara didn't pull away. He didn't notice that she didn't cry. He was already calculating his share of the $7 million the developer was paying for the dirt. He didn't see Clara put the key in her pocket. He didn't see her stand up and walk toward the back door without looking at either of them again. She didn't look back. Clara stood in the mud of the driveway. The rain had turned the gravel into a slick, grey soup. Behind her, the house was silent for the first time in 68 years. The moving truck her siblings hired had already roared away toward the city. It carried the velvet chairs, the mahogany desk, and the heavy wool rugs. Clara held a single cardboard box against her chest. Inside were her mother's favorite tea kettle and a stack of yellowed recipes. Her old dog, Gus, sat by the driver's side door of her rusted blue pickup truck. He was a golden retriever with a face turned entirely white and cataracts that made his eyes look like cloudy marbles. He didn't bark. He simply watched her with a steady, unblinking patience. Gus had been there for the last 10 years of the farm's decline. He had sat by her feet during every late-night accounting session. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her leather wallet. It was thin and cracked at the edges. She counted the bills slowly. 10, 5, 2 ones. She dug into the coin pouch and found a quarter, a dime, 5 pennies, and 2 nickels. $17.42. That was the sum total of her liquid assets after 3 decades of uncompensated labor. It wasn't enough for a motel room. It wasn't enough for a full tank of gas. It was barely enough to buy Gus a bag of kibble and herself a loaf of bread. She looked at her phone. The screen was dark. There were no missed calls from James or Sarah. There were no texts asking if she had found a place to stay. The only notification was a weather alert for a coming storm. The silence of the device felt heavier than the box in her arms. She climbed into the truck. The seat springs groaned under her weight. She placed the Cloverleaf key on the dashboard. The iron reflected the dull grey light of the afternoon. She had spent her whole life within 3 miles of this driveway. She knew the map of the valley by heart. She knew where the creek ran deep and where the old logging roads ended in thickets of briar. The stone barn sat on the very edge of the Miller land. It was tucked into a fold of the hills where the sun disappeared 2 hours early every night. No one had used it for anything but storing rusted scythes and broken fence posts since the 1950s. Her siblings had laughed when they mentioned it. They called it a pile of rocks with a view of nothing. Clara turned the ignition. The engine coughed and sputtered before catching. She drove down the long driveway for the last time. She didn't look at the fields where the developers' stakes were already driven into the earth. She didn't look at the orchard where the trees were heavy with the promise of blossoms they would never be allowed to drop. She drove toward the shadows of the hills. The road turned from asphalt to gravel, and then from gravel to dirt. The ruts grew deeper. The trees crowded the edges of the path. Gus rested his heavy head on her thigh. His breathing was slow and rhythmic. She reached the property line an hour before sunset. The barn stood in a clearing of waist-high weeds and tangled blackberry vines. It was a massive, silent shape of stacked fieldstone. One corner of the roof had collapsed, leaving a jagged gap like a broken tooth. The wooden doors were grey and weathered, hanging by single, rusted hinges. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was only the smell of damp earth and the sound of the wind whistling through the gaps in the masonry. Clara turned off the engine. The silence that rushed in was absolute. She looked at the Cloverleaf key on the dashboard. It was the only thing that felt solid in a world that had dissolved. She reached out and touched the iron. It felt cold and certain. She thought about her father's voice. He had been a man of few words, but he had loved the stone of this valley. He had always said that wood rots and glass breaks, but stone remembers. Clara stepped out of the truck and into the tall grass. Her knees ached with a dull, familiar throb. She had spent too many years kneeling on hard floors. She took a deep breath. The air tasted of pine and upcoming rain. She walked toward the barn doors. Gus followed her, his tail low but wagging slightly. She reached the heavy oak doors. They were thick and scarred by decades of weather. She found the lock. It was a massive iron mechanism, caked in dirt and spiderwebs. She took the Cloverleaf key from her pocket. Her hands trembled as she pressed the iron into the keyhole. She expected it to resist. She expected the rust to be too thick. But the key slid home with a smooth, metallic click. It felt as if the lock had been waiting for this specific piece of iron for half a century. She turned her wrist. The mechanism groaned, and then the bolt slid back. She pushed the door. It was heavy, requiring her to lean, her full weight against the wood. It swung inward with a long, low creak that echoed off the stone walls inside. The air that spilled out was ancient. It smelled of dried hay, old wool, and something else, something metallic and sharp. Clara stood in the threshold. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and fallen slate. Shadows stretched across the high rafters. She was 68 years old with $17.42. She was alone in a ruin that everyone else had discarded. She stepped inside. Clara's first morning in the stone barn began with the sound of rain hitting the slate roof. The air inside was so cold she could see her breath in the dim light. Her lower back was a solid block of dull, throbbing pain that made it impossible to stand up straight for several minutes. She sat on the edge of the tarp she had spread over the hay and rubbed her swollen knees. The skin over her joints felt tight and hot. She didn't think about the injustice of her siblings' betrayal. She didn't think about the luxury of the farmhouse. She thought about the fact that she had no way to boil water. She thought about the draft coming from the gap in the north wall. These were the only problems that mattered now. She climbed into her truck and drove the 3 miles into the village of Oakhaven. The town consisted of a single main street with a general store that had a faded green awning and a gas station with 2 antique pumps. She pulled up to the store and stepped out. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. The air inside smelled of sawdust and peppermint. A man behind the counter was stacking tins of soup. He stopped when he saw her. He was a tall man with a carpenter's hands and very few words. He looked at Clara for a long moment. "You're the Miller girl," he said. Clara paused with her hand on a loaf of bread. She hadn't been called a girl in 40 years. "I'm Clara," she said. "We heard you were back," the man said. He didn't ask why she was living in a derelict barn. He didn't mention the sale of the farm. Arthur said to watch for a woman with a Cloverleaf key. "He's been checking the road every day for a week." Clara felt a strange ripple of recognition. "Who is Arthur?" "Arthur Penhaligon," the man replied. "He lives in the cottage by the creek. He's the one who's been keeping the weeds down around that barn for 10 years. He said it was only a matter of time before a miller came back to claim the bones." Clara bought the bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a large bag of the cheapest dog food. The total came to $9.64. She walked back to her truck with $7.78 left in her pocket. As she was loading the bags into the cab, an old man in a thick flannel shirt approached her. He moved with a slight limp, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a small wooden crate filled with dry kindling and a thermos. "I'm Arthur," he said. He placed the crate in the back of her truck without asking. "I was a student of yours, 40 years ago. You taught me how to read a map when everyone else said I was too slow." Clara looked at him. The memory was faint, but it was there. A quiet boy in the back of the classroom who loved the history of the valley. "Arthur," she whispered. "The barn is older than your father told you," Arthur said. He didn't smile. He spoke with the gravity of a man delivering a message. "It's the anchor of this whole county. I've been waiting for you to open that door. I have some tools you'll need. I'll be up this afternoon." He turned and walked away before she could thank him. Clara drove back to the barn in silence. By the time she returned, the wind had picked up. The rain turned from a drizzle into a steady, punishing downpour. She spent the afternoon dragging fallen branches inside to dry. She used a piece of discarded plywood to block the largest hole in the wall. Every movement was a struggle against the gravity of her own exhaustion. As the sun began to set, the storm intensified. The wind howled through the rafters, making the heavy stone walls vibrate. Clara sat in the corner with Gus. She tried to check her phone, but the battery was at 4%. There were still no messages. No one was coming to save her. She looked at the dark ceiling and felt a wave of cold reality wash over her. She was 68 years old. She was sitting in a ruin. She had less than $8. "I cannot fix a roof," she said aloud. The words were flat and heavy. "I am 68 years old and I cannot fix a leaky roof. I don't even have a hammer." She lay down on the cold floor and pulled a blanket over Gus. She thought about the developers' bulldozers that would arrive at the main house on Monday. She thought about her siblings eating a warm dinner in the city. For a moment, she let herself wonder if it would be easier to just stop, to walk out into the rain and let the valley take her back. The math of her survival simply didn't add up. A small sound broke the silence. Gus shifted and nudged his head under her hand. He let out a soft, rhythmic huffing sound. Then, from the rafters high above, a single bird chirped. It was a small sparrow, sheltered in the dry corner of the stones. It didn't care about the storm. It didn't care about the money. It was simply alive in the space she had opened. Clara looked at the bird, then at Gus. She reached into her pocket and felt the iron cloverleaf key. "I'm not dying in this barn," she whispered. "I'm not dying because some man decided I wasn't worth keeping. I still matter." She stood up. Her knees screamed, but she ignored them. She grabbed the crate of kindling Arthur had given her. Clara sat on a milk crate in the center of the barn. The only light came from a single battery-powered lantern she had found in the glove box of her truck. The beam was weak and yellow. It threw long, distorted shadows of the rafters against the stone walls. Outside, the wind screamed through the gaps in the masonry, but inside, the silence was a physical weight. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet again. She laid the bills out on her knee. $5, 2 ones, 78 cents in change. This was the harvest of 68 years. This was the value her family had placed on 3 decades of her life. She closed her eyes and saw the lawyer's office. She saw the way the sunlight had hit the mahogany table. The inventory of her life had been read aloud like a grocery list. The 400 acres of prime pasture to James and Sarah. The 3-story Victorian farmhouse to James and Sarah. The $5 million investment portfolio to James and Sarah. While they exchanged victorious glances and checked their reflections in the polished wood, Clara received what they called the rest. She received the stone barn and a rusted iron key. They had called it a generous gift. They had called it a clean break. The cruelty wasn't in the numbers. It was in the small things. She remembered Sarah picking up the silver-framed photograph of their mother from the sideboard. Sarah hadn't looked at the face in the picture. She had looked at the hallmark on the bottom of the frame to check the purity of the metal. She had tucked it into her designer handbag without a word. When Clara asked for the recipe box in the kitchen, James had checked his watch. He told her they didn't have time for sentimental clutter. He said the house needed to be staged for the developer's walkthrough by morning. Clara looked at her phone. The battery was at 2%. She thought about calling her cousin in the next county, but she stopped. She remembered the way the family had gone silent when she entered the room at her father's funeral. She remembered the whispers about how she had stuck around just to inherit the land. They had already written the story of her greed to cover the reality of their own. She set the phone face down on the dirt floor. She didn't want to see the screen go black. The pain in her knees was a sharp, biting cold. It felt like glass grinding in the joints. She had spent too many years kneeling on the floor to scrub the baseboards Sarah wouldn't touch. She had spent too many nights carrying her father from his chair to his bed. Her body was a map of other people's needs. Now, for the first time in her life, no one was calling her name. No one was waiting for her to bring a tray or a pill or a blanket. The freedom felt like a void. It felt like falling. She picked up the cloverleaf key. It was heavy and smelled of old oil. She rubbed her thumb over the iron. Her father had held this key when he was a young man. He had told her the barn was the first thing their ancestors built. He said they lived in the barn for 3 years while they gathered the stones for the big house. He said the barn was the root and the house was just the branch. Her siblings had taken the branch and left her the root. They thought they had left her to rot in the dark. She stood up. The movement was slow and calculated. She walked to the back wall of the barn where the stones were largest. She touched the cold, damp surface. The masonry was nearly 3 feet thick. It had been built to last for centuries. It had been built to protect what was inside from the winter and the wolves. James and Sarah wanted the quick cash of the developer. They wanted the temporary sparkle of a new life. They had forgotten that the most valuable things are often the ones that are hardest to move. Clara didn't have a bed. She didn't have a stove. She had $7.78 and a dog who was going blind. But as she leaned her forehead against the ancient stone, she felt a strange, humming vibration. It wasn't the wind. It was the weight of the building itself. It was the stability of a structure that didn't need anyone's permission to stand. She wasn't just a discarded woman in a ruin. She was the only miller left who still knew how to speak to the stone. She was still here. The rain did not stop for 3 days. By the 4th morning, the floor of the stone barn was a shallow lake of mud and ice-cold water. Clara Miller, 68 years old, woke up with her fingers curled into stiff claws that refused to straighten. The dampness had settled into her marrow, a heavy, aching cold that no amount of blankets could keep out. She sat up slowly, her breath blossoming in white clouds. Every movement was a negotiation with her own skeleton. Her right knee was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, the skin stretched tight and shining with inflammation. She looked at her phone. It had finally died during the night. The black screen reflected nothing but her own tired face. There would be no more calls from the pharmacy. There would be no messages from the bank. She was cut off from a world that had already decided she was a ghost. She thought about the winter coming. She thought about the fact that she had no firewood, no stove, and exactly $7.78. The math of her survival was a cold, hard zero. Beyond that, the future was a dark room she was too afraid to enter. "I cannot do this," she whispered, into the empty barn. The words didn't echo. They were swallowed by the wet stone. She thought about the farmhouse, where the heaters would be humming in every room. She thought about the developers' crews who would be drinking hot coffee while they tore down the orchard. For a moment, she looked at the heavy timber of the rafters and wondered if it would be easier to just stop, to let the cold take her. This was what dying alone looked like. It wasn't a grand tragedy. It was a woman in a wet coat, listening to the rain and running out of reasons to stand up. A heavy knock sounded against the oak door. It wasn't the tentative tap of a stranger. It was the solid, rhythmic thud of someone who knew exactly who was inside. Clara wiped her face with a damp sleeve and stood up. She had to use the wall for support, her hand sliding over the rough fieldstone. She pulled the door open. Arthur Penhaligon stood in the mud, wearing a yellow slicker that was decades old. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer her a platitude about things getting better. He was holding a rusted iron stove in the bed of his old truck and a stack of seasoned oak planks. Behind him, a younger man she didn't recognize was unloading a heavy roll of roofing felt. "The wind is shifting to the north," Arthur said. "If we don't get that gap in the roof closed today, you'll be sleeping in a snowdrift by Tuesday." "Arthur, I can't pay you," Clara said. Her voice was thin, cracking like dry parchment. "I'm not asking for money," Arthur replied. He stepped into the barn and looked up at the rafters. "I'm paying back a debt from 1978. You gave me the only A I ever earned. You told me I had a mind for the way things were built. I've spent 40 years proving you right." He didn't wait for her permission. He and the younger man began to work. The sound of hammers hitting nails replaced the sound of the rain. They worked in a focused, practiced silence. By noon, the hole in the roof was sealed. By 2 o'clock, the iron stove was vented through a side window, and a small, fierce fire was crackling inside. The smell of wood smoke began to chase away the scent of rot and mold. Arthur handed her a thermos of coffee and a small tin of salve. "Put that on your knees," he said. "It's what the loggers use. It'll smell like pine tar, but you'll be able to walk by morning." Clara took the thermos. The heat of the metal seeped into her palms, waking up the nerves in her fingers. She looked at the small fire. It was the first warmth she had felt since she left the farmhouse. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The despair that had been a physical weight on her chest began to lift, just enough to breathe. "Why are you doing this, Arthur?" she asked. Arthur paused at the door. He looked at the thick stone walls, then back at her. "Because this isn't just a barn, Clara. This valley has a memory. Most people are too busy looking at the price of the dirt to remember what's buried in it. Your father knew. Now you're the only one left who holds the key." He climbed back into his truck and drove away into the grey mist. Clara stood by the stove. Gus moved toward the heat, his tail thumping once against the dirt floor. She looked at her hands. They were still shaking, but the claws had opened. She reached into her pocket and touched the Cloverleaf key. It was warm from the heat of the fire. She was still here. Clara spent the next 2 weeks learning the language of the stone barn. Every morning she woke before the sun touched the valley floor. She moved slowly because her fingers were stiff and her lower back felt like a rusted hinge. She applied the pine tar salve Arthur had given her to her swollen knees. The smell was sharp and medicinal, filling the small space with the scent of a deep forest. She rubbed the dark ointment into her skin until the heat of her blood made it sink into the bone. The pain did not vanish, but it became a quiet noise she could eventually ignore. She had no money for lumber or glass or hardware. She spent her days scavenging the edges of the acre of scrubland her siblings had left her. She found a pile of discarded cedar shingles buried under a thicket of blackberry vines. She carried them back to the barn 3 at a time, her breath coming in short, ragged bursts. She used an old hammer she found buried in the dirt floor near the back wall. The wooden handle was cracked and grey, but the steel head was heavy and true. She spent 4 hours nailing the shingles over a gap in the western siding. Each strike of the hammer sent a vibration through her arm that felt like a conversation with the building itself. Her routine became a clock made of labor. She fed Gus his measured portion of kibble and watched him eat. She boiled water on the iron stove for a single bowl of oatmeal. She swept the dust from the stone floor with a bundle of birch twigs she had tied together with twine. She wasn't just surviving, she was claiming the space. She found a jar of linseed oil and beeswax in the back of her truck and used an old rag to rub it into the heavy oak doors. The wood darkened and drank the oil until it began to glow with a deep amber light. By the second week, the town had begun to notice she wasn't leaving. A woman from the local bakery stopped her truck at the edge of the property. She didn't say a word, but she left a box of day-old bread and a block of sharp cheddar cheese on a flat stone near the driveway. Later that afternoon, the mail carrier left a bundle of old newspapers. Clara used the papers to line the drafty cracks in the window frames. She realized the community was watching her not with pity, but with a strange, silent expectation. One evening, the sound of heavy machinery began to echo from the north pasture. The developer's crews had arrived. She stood in the doorway of her barn and watched the yellow lights of the bulldozers. They looked like predators moving in the dark. They were tearing into the earth where she had once planted peonies with her mother. She looked at her phone, which was still dark and dead. The black screen was a reminder that the rest of the world had moved on without her. She thought about the $7.14 left in her wallet. She had spent 64 cents on a box of matches the day before. The math of her life felt impossible. She sat by the iron stove and held her head in her calloused hands. She thought, I cannot fight a corporation with $7. I am 68 years old, and I am living in a barn with no electricity while they destroy my history. The despair was a physical weight that pressed against her lungs. She looked at Gus, who was sleeping near the warmth of the fire. He looked thinner than he had 2 weeks ago. She realized she would run out of dog food in 3 days, and she had no way to buy more. This was the moment she considered walking back to the main house to beg James for a room in the city. Then she saw a flash of green. A small sprig of mint had pushed through a crack in the stone floor near the base of the stove. It must have been dormant in the dry earth for decades. The heat of the fire and the moisture from the leaking roof had woken it up. It was tiny and fragile, but it was bright green against the grey dust of the barn. It had survived years of darkness and the weight of the stone. It had waited for the right moment to come back to life. Clara reached out and touched the small, heart-shaped leaf. It smelled of summer and her mother's kitchen. She stood up, her knees cracking in the silence. She didn't look at the lights of the bulldozers in the distance. She went to her truck and grabbed a plastic bucket. She walked through the dark weeds to the creek at the edge of the property and filled it with water. She carried it back, her muscles burning with the effort. She poured a small, careful amount around the base of the mint. We're staying, she whispered to the empty room. She didn't look back. The dampness from the storm had seeped deep into the mortar of the back wall. Clara Miller spent the morning with a stiff-bristled brush and a bucket of vinegar water. She was 68 years old, and her shoulder joint clicked with every repetitive motion against the stone. She focused on a patch of white salt growth near the foundation. The work was slow. The air smelled of sharp acid and old dust. Gus sat nearby, his blind eyes fixed on the door, but his nose was twitching toward the corner where Clara worked. He stood up suddenly and walked to the wall. He began to scratch at a heavy timber beam that disappeared into the masonry. "Gus, stop that," Clara said. Her voice was raspy from the cold. "You'll pull a claw." The dog didn't stop. He whined, a low, urgent sound in the back of his throat. He nudged his head against a specific stone that sat slightly recessed from the others. It was a massive piece of granite, darker than the fieldstone around it. Clara stopped scrubbing. She wiped her hands on her trousers and knelt beside the dog. The stone looked solid. It looked like a permanent part of the world. But when she pressed her palm against the center, she felt a slight, impossible movement. The granite shifted a fraction of an inch. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. She felt the blood rushing in her ears, a dull, rhythmic thrumming. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Cloverleaf key. She didn't know why. She just needed something solid in her hand. She used the edge of the iron key to pick at the dried mud and moss around the edge of the dark stone. A thin line of darkness appeared. The stone wasn't a structural block. It was a cover. She gripped the edges of the granite. Her fingers were slick with vinegar and sweat. She pulled. Nothing happened. She shifted her weight, ignoring the sharp protest in her lower back, and pulled again with everything she had. The stone gave way. It slid forward and hit the dirt floor with a heavy, muffled thud. A cloud of fine grey dust billowed up, making her cough. Behind the stone was a hollow space. It was a perfectly square compartment, lined with lead to keep out the moisture. Inside sat a metal box. Clara sat back on her heels. Her hands were trembling so violently she had to tuck them under her arms. She stared at the box. It was made of blackened tin, sealed with a thick layer of wax around the lid. On the top of the box, embossed into the metal, was a single symbol, a cloverleaf. It was the exact shape of the head of the key in her lap. She reached out and touched the metal. It was ice cold. She took a deep breath, but the air felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. "Arthur," she whispered. "My father was right." She picked up the box. It was surprisingly heavy. She carried it over to the iron stove where the light was better. She sat on her milk crate and placed the box on her knees. She used her pocket knife to carefully scrape away the old wax. Her breath came in short, shallow hitches. She found a small, circular indentation on the side of the tin. It wasn't a keyhole, it was a pressure point. She took the cloverleaf key and pressed the head of it into the mark. The lid popped open with a soft, metallic hiss. Inside were layers of heavy vellum, wrapped in oiled silk. Clara unfolded the first layer. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she had to blink rapidly to clear it. The paper was thick and yellowed, covered in elegant, looping script. At the top of the page, the ink was still dark and clear. It read, "The Charter of the Miller Homestead and the Founding Survey of Oakhaven Valley, 1792. She read the words 3 times. She read them until the letters started to swim. She turned the page. Underneath was a hand-drawn map. It didn't show the boundaries of her father's farm. It showed the entire county. In the very center of the map, marked with a red wax seal, was a small drawing of a barn. The drawing was labeled, "The Mother Structure, the First Stone." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked at the walls around her. She looked at the massive hand-hewn timbers and the granite foundation. She wasn't just living in an abandoned barn. She was living in the legal anchor of the entire region. She turned to the final page. It was a document, signed by the first governor of the state. It stated that the central farmstead, defined by the original stone barn, was a protected site. It declared that the land within 500 yards of the structure could never be subdivided, sold for industrial use, or cleared of its original timber. The developer's maps were wrong. Her sibling's sale was illegal. Clara touched the red wax seal. The heat from the stove made the smell of the old vellum rise into the air. It smelled of cedar and history. She looked at the dead phone on the floor. She looked at the empty dog food bag. The scale of the discovery began to settle over her like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just a way to save herself. This was a way to stop the bulldozers. This was the voice of her ancestors, speaking through the stone. "They can't touch it," she said aloud. Her voice was stronger now, echoing off the high rafters. "Gus, they can't touch a single tree." She looked at the cloverleaf key resting on the map. It wasn't just a token of a dying man's affection. It was a tool of justice. Her father had known. He had waited until the very end to give her the only thing that could truly protect her. He had known that James and Sarah would look for the gold and the deeds, but they would never look at the bones of the land. She sat in the silence of the barn for a long time. The fire in the stove crackled, throwing orange light across the documents. She felt a strange, quiet calm. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks was gone. It had been replaced by a weightless, soaring certainty. She closed the tin box and held it against her chest. Everything was different now. Clara was 68 that November, and the physical transformation of the stone barn became a slow, rhythmic war against a century of decay. She did not have the money for a contractor or a restoration crew. She had a wire brush, a bucket of white vinegar, and a bag of lime she had bartered from the local hardware store for her father's old copper weather vane. She spent 4 days on the south wall alone. She scrubbed until the grey soot of decades fell away in a fine, choking powder. Underneath the grime, the granite revealed itself to be a pale, shimmering rose color. The stone was not dead. It had simply been waiting for someone to remind it of the light. She moved her cot to the center of the room, away from the drafts. She used the oak planks Arthur had left to build a low platform that kept her mattress off the damp earth. Her knees protested every time she climbed the short ladder she had salvaged from the scrubland. She rubbed the pine tar salve into her joints every night by the light of the iron stove. The pain was still there, but it had changed from a sharp, biting cold to a dull, manageable hum. She felt the strength returning to her forearms. Her grip on the wire brush grew steady and sure. The windows were the greatest challenge. The narrow arrow slits in the masonry had been open to the elements for 50 years. Clara spent a week cleaning the narrow sills of bird droppings and rotted wood. She found several sheets of thick, wavy glass in the crawl space of the abandoned schoolhouse, 3 miles away. She didn't have a glass cutter, so she took the pieces to the town glazier. He was a man who had been in her 3rd grade class 40 years ago. He looked at the glass, then at Clara's work-worn hands. He didn't ask for a single cent. He told her he had heard about the mother structure and wanted his work to be part of the bones of the valley. She installed the glass using a mixture of linseed oil and putty. When the afternoon sun finally hit the western wall, the light didn't just enter the room. It shattered into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced across the rose-colored stone. The barn no longer smelled of wet earth and rot. It smelled of beeswax, wood smoke, and the sharp, clean scent of the lime mortar. She spent her evenings repointing the joints between the stones. She pushed the wet mortar into the gaps with a small steel trowel. She worked until her knuckles bled and her eyes burned from the dust. The community began to arrive in small, quiet ways. A farmer from the next ridge brought a load of seasoned hickory for the stove. A woman from the local church left a braided wool rug on the doorstep. It was stained and frayed at the edges, but it was thick and warm. Clara laid it in front of the stove for Gus. The dog spent his days curled on the wool, his blind eyes following the sound of Clara's trowel against the stone. He looked stronger now. His coat had regained some of its old luster from the warmth of the fire. The interior of the barn began to reflect the order of Clara's mind. She built a small kitchen area using 3 wooden crates and a piece of salvaged slate. She organized her mother's tea kettle and the recipe box on a shelf she carved from a fallen cedar branch. The most important feature was the heavy oak table she had constructed from the leftovers of the roof repair. It sat in the center of the room, directly under the highest point of the rafters. On top of the table, she placed the blackened tin box. The vellum documents were spread out, held down at the corners by smooth river stones. By the end of the month, the barn was no longer a ruin. It was a fortress. The walls were clean and solid. The roof was tight against the coming snow. The windows held the light and kept out the wind. Clara stood in the center of the room and looked at the transformation. She had done this with her own hands and the help of people who remembered her name. She had $17.12 in her wallet. She had no television and no electricity. But for the first time in 30 years, she was not a ghost in someone else's house. She was the mistress of the mother structure. She walked to the oak table and touched the red, wax seal on the founding charter. The light from the wavy glass hit the seal and made it glow like a small, hot coal. The barn was beautiful. It was not the beauty of the farmhouse with its polished mahogany and silk curtains. It was a beauty of weight and endurance. It was the beauty of something that had been discarded and found its way back to the sun. The stone was warm. Clara stood before the small, cracked mirror she had hung near the stone hearth. She was 68 years old, and the woman looking back at her was a stranger. Her skin was mapped with deeper lines, and her silver hair was pulled back with a piece of twine, but her eyes were no longer looking for permission to exist. She looked at her hands, stained with lime and calloused from the wire brush. For 30 years, these hands had belonged to everyone else. They had carried trays and changed bandages and balanced ledgers for people who never said thank you. Now, the dirt under her fingernails was her own. The ache in her shoulders was the price of her own roof. She walked to the back of the barn and touched the cool granite of the mother structure. "You were right, Dad," she whispered. The words didn't disappear into the rafters this time. They felt solid, as if the building were nodding back. She no longer thought about the farmhouse with a hollow chest. She didn't wonder what James was doing, or if Sarah had sold the silver frames. That life felt like a coat she had outgrown. It was too small and too heavy to wear anymore. The community didn't arrive with a fanfare. They arrived with curiosity. It started with the local librarian, a woman named Martha, who had once lived in the city. She drove up the muddy track in a small hatchback. She didn't bring food. She brought a camera and a notebook. She stood in the center of the barn and looked at the vellum documents on the oak table. She didn't speak for 5 minutes. "Do you know what this is, Clara?" Martha finally asked. "It's my family," Clara said. "It's the birth certificate of this county," Martha corrected her. Her voice was hushed, the way people speak in cathedrals. Within a week, the word had spread through Oakhaven like a slow-moving tide. People began to appear at the edge of the scrubland. They weren't the developers or the lawyers. They were the people whose grandfathers had worked the mill and whose mothers had taught in the one-room schoolhouse. They brought folding chairs and sat in the tall grass. They watched Clara work on the stone. Some of them brought old photographs of the valley. They compared the landmarks in the pictures to the map on Clara's table. Clara didn't invite them in, but she didn't turn them away. She made a large pot of tea on the iron stove and set out a stack of mismatched mugs. She sat at the oak table and listened to their stories. A man named Henry told her about the time the creek flooded in 1962. A woman named Evelyn showed her the spot on the north wall where her own father had carved his initials in the stone. The barn was no longer a secret. It was becoming a library of shared memory. The inner shift happened on a Tuesday evening. The sun was setting behind the ridge, turning the interior of the barn a deep, glowing orange. Clara sat on her cot and felt a physical unclenching in her chest. It wasn't a sudden surge of joy. It was a stillness. It was the feeling of a heavy weight being set down after a long walk. She realized she was no longer waiting for an apology from her siblings. She didn't need them to admit they were wrong. Their opinion was a currency that no longer held value in this room. She looked at Gus. He was sleeping soundly, his chest rising and falling in the warmth of the fire. She looked at the rose-colored stone she had scrubbed clean. She had $17.12. She had no pension and no inheritance, but she had the mother structure. She had a seat at the table of the valley's history. One afternoon, a school bus stopped at the end of the driveway. A dozen children climbed out, followed by a young teacher Clara didn't recognize. The teacher approached the barn doors tentatively. "We heard the history lives here now," the teacher said. Clara stood up and wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the children, then back at the oak table where the documents lay. She felt a quiet, steady strength rise up from the soles of her feet. She wasn't just a retired teacher living in a ruin. She was the keeper of the anchor. "Come in," Clara said, "but mind the dog. He's the one who found the door." She was no longer alone. The black SUV appeared at the end of the muddy track on a Tuesday afternoon. It looked like a sleek, predatory insect against the soft greens and grays of the valley. Clara Miller stood in the doorway of the stone barn, a heavy wooden mallet in her hand. She watched her brother James climb out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a cashmere overcoat that cost more than her truck. Sarah followed him, her high-heeled boots sinking instantly into the soft earth. She made a sharp, clicking sound of disgust as she looked at the puddles. They didn't look like siblings returning home. They looked like tourists visiting a disaster site. "Clara, thank God," James said. He held up his hands as he approached, his face twisted into an expression of profound concern. "We've been losing sleep thinking about you out here in the cold." Sarah reached the threshold and fanned the air in front of her nose. The smell of wood smoke and pine tar was too honest for her. "It's a health hazard, Clara. Truly. At your age, you can't manage this kind of isolation." Clara didn't move. She didn't invite them inside. She felt the weight of the mallet in her hand and the solidity of the stone at her back. She looked at James's eyes. They weren't looking at her face. "We heard about the little discovery you made," James said. He tried to chuckle, but the sound was thin and brittle. "A bit of old paper and some local history. It's charming, really, but you need professional help to manage a legacy like this. We've already spoken to a wonderful consultant in the city," Sarah added. She reached out to touch Clara's arm, but Clara stepped back. "They can help us turn this into a tax-exempt foundation. You'll be so much more comfortable in that assisted living center." Clara looked at her sister. She saw the way Sarah's eyes traveled over the rose-colored granite. Sarah wasn't thinking about a library. She was thinking about the government grants and the heritage funding that came with a mother structure designation. "The developer called us Clara," James said. The mask of concern slipped for a fraction of a second. His planning application for the north pasture was denied this morning. Something about a 500-yard historic buffer zone. He's furious. He's threatening to sue us for breach of contract. You should have planned better, James, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of the masonry. James snapped. He stepped forward, his face reddening. We gave you this heap because the developer said the demolition costs for 3-foot-thick stone would eat the entire profit margin. You were supposed to be the one holding the liability, not the gold mine. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in the rafters. James realized what he had said. He tried to pull the mask back into place, but it was too late. You gave me a ruin because you thought it was worthless, Clara said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You thought I was worthless. You were wrong about both. Clara, don't make this harder than it needs to be, Sarah pleaded. We're family. Dad would have wanted us to share in this. It's a clean break, remember? That's what you said. I didn't say it, Clara replied. You did. You wrote the papers. You chose the map. You picked the silver frames off the sideboard while our mother's ashes were still warm. She turned and walked to the oak table. She picked up the iron cloverleaf key. She held it up so the afternoon sun caught the rusted edges. This key doesn't open a bank vault, Clara said. It opens a story. And you two aren't in it anymore. The historic designation is already filed. The land is protected. The mother structure belongs to the valley now. You can't do this, James hissed. We'll tie this up in court for 10 years. You have no money, Clara. You have $7 and a dying dog. Clara looked at Gus. The dog stood up and walked to her side. He leaned his heavy shoulder against her leg. He didn't growl. He simply stared toward the door with his milky eyes. I have the town, James, Clara said. I have the archivist, the glazier, and the families who have been waiting 40 years for a Miller to remember the stone. They've already signed the witness statements. Your developer can't build a birdhouse within a mile of this door. She walked back to the entrance. She didn't look at their expensive clothes or their angry faces. She looked at the horizon. Please leave, Clara said. The mud is getting on my floor. James opened his mouth to speak, but Sarah caught his arm. She looked at Clara and realized for the first time that the woman she had spent 30 years ignoring was gone. In her place stood someone as permanent and unyielding as the granite foundation. They turned and walked back to the SUV. The engine roared to life, a discordant sound in the quiet clearing. The tires spun in the mud, throwing a spray of grey silt against the blackberry vines. Clara watched until the red tail lights vanished. She pushed the heavy oak doors shut. The bolt clicked into place with a sound like a period at the end of a long, dark sentence. The door stayed closed. 1 year after the morning she arrived in the rain, the mud of the driveway had been replaced by crushed white stone. The developer's yellow machines had been hauled away months ago. The north pasture was empty of stakes and full of wild clover. The apple orchard remained standing, its branches heavy with a canopy of white blossoms. Clara Miller, now 69, stood in the doorway of the stone barn. She was wearing a clean linen apron over a sturdy work dress. The interior of the barn was cool and smelled of lavender and old paper. The rose-colored granite walls shimmered in the May light. A small wooden sign hung beside the entrance. It read, The Mother Structure, Historical Site No. 001. 3 school buses were parked at the end of the drive. A group of children sat on the grass, listening to Arthur Penhaligon explain the red wax seal on the founding charter. Arthur wore a new flannel shirt and moved with a straighter back. He pointed to the map on the oak table. The children leaned in, their faces full of a quiet wonder. Gus lay in a patch of sunlight by the door. His tail thumped a slow, steady rhythm against the clean wood floor. He could no longer see the children, but he lifted his head to catch the scent of the clover on the wind. He looked stronger than he had in years. Clara reached up and touched the leather cord around her neck. The iron cloverleaf key rested against her chest, warm from the sun. She unhooked the cord and walked to the oak table. She placed the key on a small brass hook beside the mother structure map. It was no longer a tool for a lock. It was a part of the exhibit. She walked out to the edge of the clearing. She looked toward the high ridge where her father was buried. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She smoothed her apron with her calloused hands. I kept the root, Dad, she whispered. The blossoms fell like snow. Clara's journey proves that the world can take your house, your money, and your comfort, but it can never take the truth of your own worth. When you stand on a foundation of integrity, you are as permanent as the ancient stone of the valley. James and Sarah looked at the land and saw a price tag. They looked at their sister and saw a liability. But they forgot that the things built to last are rarely the things that shine the brightest. They didn't understand that a woman who has spent 30 years serving others has developed a strength that a bank account can never match. Clara didn't just save a barn. She saved the soul of a community. She reminded every person in the valley that their history is not a commodity to be traded. She proved that one person standing in their truth is more powerful than a corporation standing on a lie. The mother structure still stands because Clara Miller refused to be moved. If Clara's story moved you, if you've ever felt the weight of being underestimated because of your age, or felt the sting of being discarded by those who should have protected you, this story is for you. Leave one word in the comments describing the moment Clara closed the heavy oak door on her siblings for the last time. Because Clara's story proves something that is always true. A legacy built on truth and sacrifice will always stand taller than a fortune built on greed and betrayal. Share this with someone who needs to remember that your greatest discovery often happens exactly where everyone else told you there was nothing left to find. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.